Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome into the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. Brief detour before meat and potatoes. In this episode, by the way, I want to talk about frame rate, frames per second, especially when Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is concerned. How important is frame rate, really? And then I want to talk about a little kind of a geeky pondering that I had concerning acoustics of famous places or historic places. So we're going to talk about those two things. The quick tangent right off the bat is that getting ready for work this morning, I was annoying my wife with my silliness as usual, imagining that my son would be born and he would come out a little Irishman, a little stereotypical caricature of an Irishman, that he would come out wearing buckle shoes with a shillelagh, a little vest on, a hat with the four-leaf clover in it. And I even imagine a little pipe. And he'd come out, top of the morning, Daddy. Aye, what a fine-looking day. Oh, sea shanty, how do you do? Singing bar songs. For some reason, just pictured him come out. Top of the morning, Daddy. Hey, what a fine day. It was making me crack up. Just crack up. Just a little tiny infant with a scowly face, but it's just so happy and up on the day, Irish. And she's like, why? My wife goes, why does our child have an Irish accent? Why is the accent part of it? Why is he talking, but why is his accent Irish? I don't know. It was just funny to me. Top of the day, Daddy. All right, moving on. I'm sorry, I'm crying a little bit. For some reason, it was just the funniest thing in the world to me this morning. Oh, man. Okay. I had a brief discussion with my friend Nathan, who I've had on the show. And by brief discussion, I mean I replied to a comment he left on a Facebook post. I put a Facebook post up on the Geek Therapy Radio Facebook. Wink, wink. Go like and follow Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook. It's a great way to keep in touch with me. If you don't want to send me a letter on geektherapyradio.com or by other means. I posted to Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook a picture of my current RAM usage in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, to which Nathan replied, 10 FPS, ouch, or oof. And it just kind of got me thinking. I've got Microsoft Flight Simulator going behind me right now. Hopefully you can't hear the whine of my laptop too much, but it's humming away at currently 12 frames per second. I flew out of Van Nuys Airport in Southern California to Simi Valley. Simi Valley is a place where I spent a few years of my life, Simi Valley, California. On the other side of the mountains from Malibu. It's kind of neat. Right? I think it's just north of Northridge. Yeah. What's the name of all the streets? DeSoto and... Oh, man. Okay, so anyways, I'm flying there at 10 or 12 glorious frames per second right now. So Nathan's saying 10 frames per second, oof. It just got me thinking. Oh, by the way, I put that post up there to show my RAM usage, which was around 22 gigabytes of RAM. 22 gigabytes of RAM for Flight Simulator. Using 22 gigabytes of RAM, 10 frames per second. I reminded Nathan, yeah, this is 10 frames per second, or 12 frames per second, whatever it was. But I am running at absolute maximum settings on a Intel Core i7, 4 cores, 8 threads. Core i7 from 2016 or 2017. It's a 6700 HQ. Maybe that's 18, I forget. And the graphics card is a GTX 1060, a 6 gigabyte GTX 1060. 10 glorious frames per second. Oof. And that just got me thinking. I've been playing, and let me know what you think. Maybe if you've been playing flight simulators your whole life. I know that in PCMR, in the PC Master Race and PC gaming, it is a disgusting notion to even suggest playing a game at below 60 frames per second. And a lot of PC gamers now would even snuff at anything below 120 frames per second. To which my reply, maybe I'm just being a more realistic PC gamer, and by far the most gaming I do is on PC. The most recent console that I own is a PlayStation 3. That's the last console. Actually, I'm sorry about that. The Nintendo Switch is more recent than that, but that's not much more powerful, if at all more powerful than a PlayStation 3. So I don't have a PlayStation 4. I don't have any intentions really to, with my own money, buy a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X. By and large, I'm a PC gamer. And maybe I'm being a little bit more realistic about this. Maybe this is showing my age. Maybe this is showing my experience playing flight simulators over the years. Remember in a show or two ago, I said that I went back to play Flight Simulator for the Commodore 64, and that ish is like 1 frame per second, if that. Frame. That is how fast Flight Simulator works on the Commodore 64, and it's not much better on MS-DOS machines of throughout the 80s. 1 frame per second, 2 frames, maybe 3 frames per second if you were balling on a 286, playing Flight Simulator 4.0 on a 286. It was the similar story, Flight Simulator 95, playing it on a 486. I mean, I don't know if I ever saw 60 frames per second on a 486. I don't know if I ever saw 30 frames per second on a 486. I don't recall seeing frame rates that high, maybe on the first Pentiums that came out. So in terms of frame rates, it really, to me, growing up playing video games, it really depends on the game entirely. Myst was sure as heck not 60 frames a second, but Myst is regarded as one of the best turn-based strategy games, RPGs, whatever you want to call it, of all time. It was a technological breakthrough. It was a very confusing game. I'll admit I never got very far in it, but it certainly wasn't a 60 FPS banger from the early 90s. It wasn't. Console games regularly run at 30 frames per second, and it's perfectly fine. I would say playing God of War on PlayStation 3 at 30 frames per second, I forget what it actually runs at, but if it ran at 60 FPS, it certainly wasn't prolonged periods. I don't actually recall. But playing certain games is fine if you're not running it at 60 frames per second. Is all I'm getting at. It depends on the game. There's no way you could play Rocket League or Fortnite or any first-person shooter or CSGO or anything like that at anything below 60 frames per second. And I would argue, possibly, given the competitive nature of something like CSGO, that if you're below 120 frames per second, it's arguable that you can play it. Let's stick to Rocket League. No way I could play Rocket League below 60 frames a second. If Rocket League dips below 60 frames per second, you reduce settings so that you can get the 60 frames per second. Esports in general, you're going to want to get the settings right so that it's at least 60 frames per second. Of course, esports, it's competitive. You want a high frame rate. Street Fighter 2, 3, 4, 5, you want 60 frames per second at least. It's competitive. You need to make decisions based on individual frames, and frames matter in competitive games. You want 60 frames per second at minimum. But my argument here is that Flight Simulator, throughout history, has been more of a sightseeing game. It's a simulation that doesn't require, at nearly any point in the game, maybe if you're trying to land the airplane at 5 frames per second, We did in the past with Flight Simulator 2020. It's kind of difficult. You want more. If you're running at 5 frames per second, that could be the difference of a couple feet between you and the runway, how close you are to the runway. So you want it to be relatively smooth when you're landing the airplane, for instance. But what is smooth in Microsoft Flight Simulator? It is a gigantic game. We all know that. The hardware you need to run it at any sort of smooth playable frame rate is gargantuan. A 1060 is no slouch of a GPU even in the year 2020. It's still fully capable of playing a lot of games at 60 frames per second at fairly high settings. I'm running it at Ultra right now, Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 Ultra settings, 1080p, and I'm getting 12 frames per second currently flying over with the coast of California. I see the Pacific Coast Highway to my right, the Pacific Ocean beneath me, and going further west to my left. 12 frames per second. GTX 1060. Given that Flight Simulator 2020 is the absolute daddy Mac of sightseeing games by its very nature, I would argue that with Flight Simulator 2020, to me, how good the game looks takes precedent over sheer frame rate. I could reduce all the settings in my graphics here in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. I could reduce it all down to bare minimum, and I could get 60 frames per second fairly easily with GTX 1060. I could even go down to 1280 by 720p, all reduced settings. I could get that frame rate up there buttery smooth. But then things just don't look good. And in a game that's touted to be the best looking game of all time, this is going to sound sacrilege. It's going to sound weird. 10 frames a second right now, flying over Southern California in full detail, in full beauty, in full glory, in full AI, in full air traffic, in full physics, in full realism. 10 frames a second looks great. What am I doing right now? I'm not even touching my computer. It's an autopilot right now. I've got the sun setting to the west over the Pacific Ocean, the volumetric clouds looking gorgeous, the photogrammetry looking gorgeous, the satellite data looking gorgeous. It's the plane model's gorgeous. It's fine at 10 frames per second. It's a leisure game. It's not an esports competitive game. It's a leisurely game. So my argument is that in a leisurely game, in a sightseeing game like Flight Simulator 2020, I highly recommend ramping up the beauty at the sacrifice of frames for a casual game like Flight Simulator 2020. You would have a better experience. I promise you, you'll have a better experience with Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 if you favor the details, the graphical details over frames. That sounds, I know, so counterintuitive to anything PC Master Race, anything gaming, but it's true. If your hardware can't handle 1080p in Microsoft Flight Simulator, can't handle even 1080p 60 frames a second at ultra settings, that's fine. That's fine. Turn the VSync on, cap it to 20 frames per second, ramp up the visual beauty of the game. You will have so much of a better experience. That's a bold statement, but there are probably Flight Simulator veterans, some of you at least, that would agree with that sentiment. In a game that's all about beauty, you want to retain the beauty at the sacrifice of speed and frames per second. That being said, I would be remiss if given the opportunity, I would love to keep the ultra settings and keep all the eye candy and run it at 60 frames per second or higher, possibly even in 4K. And I am drooling over the idea of eventually getting an RTX 3080 or an RTX 3090. I'm probably not going to do a 3070 just because if I'm going to be spending money, spend money. And there's no foreseeable future when I could justify spending that money. But I'm just saying, if it ever comes to the point where I can spend the money on a new graphics card, I'm not going to waste time. Just personally, if I'm spending money on something mid-tier, I'm going 3080 or 3090, knowing that I'm not going to buy another graphics card for another 4 or 5 years at least. That's just what I typically do. So if I pop a 3090 in here, not in the laptop obviously, but if I pop a RTX 3090 in my Ryzen 9 3900X build, and I have 12 cores, 24 threads, and an RTX 3090 with 24 gigabytes of VRAM and over 10,000 CUDA cores, ridiculousness. Yeah, I'm going to want my visual settings cranked up to the absolute maximum ultra in Flight Simulator 2020, and I want every single bit of that 60 frames per second. Of course. But to recap the sentiment before moving on to the next geeky topic, doesn't matter what hardware you're running Flight Simulator 2020 with, or any casual, beautiful game, I'm in the boat of I want the beauty. I want the graphical eye candy in favor of frame rates. But it's completely the opposite in competitive games and esports, where I'm going to want frame rates at the sacrifice of eye candy. And now, before we move on to the next geek topic of acoustics, I want to bring up a little tip if you're having problems with Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 crashing. And by crashing, I mean the program actually crashing. There's plenty of time. I've experienced this plenty of times playing Flight Simulator 2020 in the past week or so that it's been out, that I'll be flying along just fine, and then I'll blink my eye, and I'm right back at my desktop. Flight Simulator 2020 has just Alt F4'd itself. I haven't forced closed the program. It's just you're flying along, and then but you're at your desktop. In Flight Simulator 2020 is no longer a task that's running. It just shuts itself down. Or what happens, as what happened to me earlier today, which forced this issue, flying along just fine, been flying along for 30 minutes or so, talking to my boss about Flight Simulator 2020. He goes, "Oh, look at your screen." I look over, and it's blue screen of death. The Windows blue screen of death. So if you've been playing Flight Simulator and it's been crashing to desktop, or you've been playing Flight Simulator and you get blue screen of death, or your computer shuts down or restarts, I've done a little Googling, and I haven't found this on Google anywhere, so this is an exclusive little tip. I don't know if it's going to work for you. I don't know if I'm onto something here, but I have tried this, and thus far I've had Flight Simulator running on my laptop for probably the past 2 hours with no issue and no shutdowns. Fingers crossed. Whatever I've done here, this tip that I'm going to tell you has helped the crashing issue quite a bit in my case, at least on my laptop. And that tip is this, and this goes against PC Master Race, I understand. But what helped me here is it just kind of dawned on me, what if despite, my GPU and my CPU, despite the fact that they are not throttling, that in fact I'm looking at, my GPU and it's hovering around 70 degrees Celsius, and my CPU and GPU are both running individually at about 70 degrees Celsius or so, 75 degrees Celsius tops on both. And they're not running at 100% utilization on both. So I'm using like 50% of the GPU, 50% of the CPU. This is just what the system is reporting. This is just what MSI Afterburner is reporting, and opening up Core Temp and looking at my cores and seeing what they're doing. That's just what the monitoring software is recording, that I'm not pegging my system at 100%. I haven't been able to test or verify this, but the tip that has helped with the crashing has been going into the power settings for both, if you have MSI Afterburner or any other kind of software that allows you to tweak or overclock or undervolt your GPU and CPU. I went into MSI Afterburner and I reduced my clocks by about 400 megahertz. And I went into the power mode settings of Windows and I reduced my maximum CPU load to like 99%. so that my CPU wasn't running at its base clock. Actually, it is running at its base clock to make sure that it's not really turboing up too much, if at all. I'm basically running Flight Simulator right now at like 2.5 gigahertz. Basically, what I'm getting at is power limiting the GPU and the CPU, because it kind of dawned on me that on my laptop, at least, what if I'm just pulling so much current that my power supply can't keep up with it, that the brick can't keep up with it? I don't know what the power rating of the brick that powers a laptop is, but what if I'm just running it too hard, balls to the wall for too long, and it's going into some sort of power save mode where it saves itself a little bit? Because despite the monitoring software, and if you know more about this than I do, feel free to let me know. Despite the monitoring software saying that I'm not taxing anything too heavily, the fans are just blasting. They're just whining away like I am running something, like I'm running a synthetic benchmark at full tilt. You got to remember also there's other components being utilized here, that just because the CPU and GPU are showing that I'm not pegging them at 100% or even 90%, that it could be that my NVMe drive is heating up too much. That could be getting too hot. There's other components in the computer that are drawing power, and the overall system load power draw is tripping some sort of power reset state. So my fix as of now, and computer's behind me humming away, Flight Simulator still running just fine the past couple hours, hasn't crashed since I've done this, is power limiting the CPU and GPU to allow a little bit more overhead, a little more power consumption overhead. That might help you if you were experiencing similar crashing, similar blue screens of death even. Consider power limiting the main components of your computer or laptop. I get the same kind of crashing at home with my desktop playing Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. And to refresh, that's a GTX 980 GPU, the Ryzen 3900X CPU, and my power supply is a 750 watt Corsair. It should be able to handle everything just fine, and for the most part it does, but I still get these random, I'll be playing Flight Simulator for an hour and it'll just crash. I'm wondering if, like on my laptop using MSI Afterburner and various power limiting tools for the CPU, if I go to my desktop and instead of overclocking my GTX 980, if I power limit it a little bit, if I only allow it to go to maybe 90% of its load, and do the same thing for my CPU, instead of overclocking the CPU to 4.3 gigahertz on one die and 4.225 on the other die, if I just, cap the processor altogether at 4 gigahertz in Flight Simulator 2020 mode, so I have a little more headroom, power, consumption headroom on the CPU and more power consumption headroom on the GPU, that it might help smooth out my experience in Flight Simulator 2020 the exact same way as it has helped on my laptop here. I'm curious about this. If any of you have Flight Simulator 2020 and you want to try this and let me know if I'm onto something here, maybe, that'd be interesting. I'm going to try it at home, and I'll let you know whenever I come up with those results. There is a patch also today I would fail to mention. A patch also today that came out for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. I don't know exactly what it did. It's a small patch. It's like 80 kilobytes. I would think it was something to do with stability. I would hope. System stability. I downloaded the patch earlier today, and to clarify here, I downloaded that patch earlier today, and before I did any of this power limiting, and it was still crashing. It didn't really help the crashing issue, at least not in my case. Only after I did the power limiting did I help smooth out the gameplay, and it hasn't crashed since I've done the power limiting. So let me know if you have Flight Simulator 2020 and you try this power limiting theory tip. Let me know how it goes. All right. Now let's move on to the next kind of geeky topic. I had been thinking about today. I don't know how much time I'm going to spend on this, but let's just dive right into it. I was reading an article. Yesterday, I left some links to AnonTech and another website. But I did find this article again on Ars Technica. There's some websites that I go to. Ars Technica is one of the tabs that I keep open at all times, along with AnonTech and Popular Mechanics and all sorts of other stuff. Anyways, this article in AnonTech, it's titled Stonehenge Lego Scale Model Reveals the Pagan Monument's Unique Soundscape. And my point here is not to go into depth about the article, but there's a concept in here that Stonehenge amplified voices and music within the circle structure of Stonehenge and did not amplify it outside of Stonehenge. This makes sense. Again, this is not my main point here, but this makes sense because if you think of Stonehenge in that it's a huge rock and then an open space, huge rock, open space, huge rock, open space, huge rock, open space, big flatness like a rectangular rock and then filled with equidistant open spaces. If you're in the center of those rocks and you say something, you're going to hear the reflection and amplification of your voice off of those rocks, and some sound waves will pass through the open spaces between the rocks. So that if you are outside that circle and you are in one of the gaps between the rocks, you'll hear the speaker speaking. But if you go to behind one of the rocks from the outside, it's going to block the speaker's voice and it's not going to be amplified. So the loudest you're ever going to hear anything outside of Stonehenge is if you have direct line of sight between the rocks to the speaker in the middle of Stonehenge. But if you're in Stonehenge, you're going to get the line of sight audio sound coming out of the speaker's mouth, plus you're inside Stonehenge, so you're going to get those reverberations off the rocks. So you kind of get doubled up the sound, whereas outside of Stonehenge, you're only going to hear the line of sight normal volume. Does that make sense? It's hard to describe over the radio, but hopefully I did an adequate job. So that's fascinating. That wasn't my main point here. The article goes on and it mentions, because this is not the point of the article, but it mentions that the group studying this model of Stonehenge in an anechoic chamber in England, they took a laser mapping of the actual Stonehenge in order for them to 3D print and replicate a 1:12 scale model of Stonehenge that would fit in their anechoic chamber in their university in England. That allowed them to take an acoustic model also. That's how they're building their acoustic models. They took the laser scans, non-acoustically, the laser scans of the structure, reproduced it at 1/12 scale, and now they're taking the acoustic models of Stonehenge in that scale. Acoustic engineers have long since been making acoustic models of different spaces. For instance, at any venue you go to, music venue you go to, it's not just setting up a bunch of speakers and then turning on the sound system, and that's the sound system. I mean, some places that can't afford to put much effort into their sound system, yes, all they do is buy a bunch of powerful amplifiers and put a bunch of speakers up in a mixing board and they're off to the races. But any well-known music venue that is set up for the purpose of concerts, you don't just have audio engineers in there setting up the sound system. You have acoustic engineers in there taking samples and data points from all around the venue about how the sound sounds in certain areas of the venue, how it reflects off this wall, even up into including how does the sound bounce off the men's room door in the bathrooms when you're standing at the bar? How are the acoustics there? Do they need any reinforcement? What kind of, are there standing waves? If you're standing at the bar buying a beer, are there any standing waves piling up? Does 2,000 kilohertz just pile up right there at the bar and just cause you just this ear-piercing gnash in your ears when you're standing at the bar? They take all that into account. Acoustic engineering is a crazy crazy in-depth science, and it's required to get the best sound out of a sound system and a particular venue. There are sound effects used in audio production programs. Usually they're just called plugins. You use plugins in a Photoshop when you edit photos. You use plugins when you edit videos. You certainly use plugins when you edit audio. Some of these plugins emulate the acoustic characteristics of real places on Earth. For instance, you can model the reverberation and the acoustics and the sound of the chamber within Notre Dame. Luckily, before Notre Dame, the cathedral at Notre Dame, the roof burned off, not me, but acoustic engineers had sampled Notre Dame for years and years and years. We have all the data, acoustic data in the world of Notre Dame, so that when you go and sit down at your laptop and you record a vocal track, you can apply the exact same acoustics from Notre Dame onto your vocal track. You can do the same for Red Rocks in Colorado. You can do the same thing for the Astrodome. You can do the same thing for many famous places. And what that got me thinking, the real geek notion here is that coming from a background in audio, for those of you who don't know, I went to audio engineering school in North Hollywood. I've engineered albums, I've produced albums, I've mastered albums, I record music, master music, mix music. It used to be a gig of mine. Maybe I'll start it up again. If I didn't have to work a full-time job, I would probably start advertising again that I mix albums. But it takes up time, and I just don't have time. But it's something that I do, that I've invested myself into. I know my way around Pro Tools, Cakewalk Sonar, Adobe Audition. I hate Audition, but Audacity, but mainly Pro Tools. Got certified with Pro Tools, even though I prefer Cakewalk Sonar. And I've got a background in audio, so I tend to think of audio not as an afterthought. Many people treat audio as an afterthought. For instance, they'll think about getting this gigantic $6,000 8K TV, and then they'll put a couple $100s into the sound system. I think people underestimate. They don't think about how important audio is to experiencing a thing, a production, or what I'm getting at here, a place. That perhaps, if there isn't already, there needs to be a bigger push, a bigger scientific push at bare minimum for acoustic engineers to go across the world and acoustically map, acoustically sample every famous piece of architecture, every famous cathedral, every famous government building, every famous natural area, the Grand Canyon or different canyons around the world, mountaintop. I don't know how they would acoustically sample a mountaintop, but they could. But go into famous places and take acoustic samples of them, so we can preserve their sound forever. Not the sounds that they make, but what it sounds like being there. That when you couple what it sounds like being there with what it looks like being there, which is something that we have been doing for decades. We see pictures, films of famous places, couple that with the actual acoustics of the place. It's kind of like the sense of smell. And we can't really do that right now, replicate. We don't have smell-o-vision so much right now. I mean, if you're looking at a dump, I could fart next to you and give you pretty good representation, or a horse stable. But a lot of people, scientists say that the sense of smell is the closest direct connection with our memories, that we associate memories through life most closely with their sense of smell. Makes sense? The smell of your mother, the smell of your father. When I think about my dad, I think about the three combined smells. I think of cigarette smoke, Marlboros, coffee. Remember, this is all together into one cacophony of smells. And poop. Every morning, using the bathroom after my dad, who would sit on the toilet, drinking coffee and smoking a cigarette, taking a dump. So one of the smells locked into my brain forever is the smell of coffee mixed with cigarettes, mixed with turd. That's what I think about with my dad. That's the smell I associate. Sound is also, I don't know if it's a definite second to smell as far as ingraining memories into our brains, but it has to rank up there. Many times we can't perfectly remember what someone's face looked like. Teachers that we might have had over the years, teachers that we didn't like or teachers that we did like. But very oftentimes you can remember their voice, boy. You can remember their voice, or maybe it's just me because they were always yelling at me. It's very distinct. I have all the love in the world for my science teacher in high school at NCA, Miss Von Dolan. She was also the French teacher. I picture her face perfectly. She's on Facebook, and I'm reminded of her face, but I can also picture her voice. I can picture her voice. That sounds weird. I can remember her voice. The auditory part of remembering this person is crystal clear. Auditory perception is such a critical part of experiencing something or someplace. So while we have these places, I think we should make a push to preserve the audio qualities of those places to go along with the visual qualities of those places. And that's kind of the where my geek brain went today with the Stonehenge article. It wasn't how they're studying the acoustical effects of being in the middle of Stonehenge versus being outside of Stonehenge. It was that they laser mapped it, and now they're acoustically recording the acoustical data of Stonehenge, and that we grabbed the acoustical data of Notre Dame Cathedral before it burned to the ground. Because you know what? Another geek thought that just occurred to me. When they rebuild the roof of the Notre Dame Cathedral, if they haven't already started to, you can use the acoustical data to help shape the roof or help reproduce the experience of being in the cathedral. You can slap any old roof on it, but people are going to get in there, and whether they fully realize it or not, it's not going to sound the same. And sound is one of our senses, one of our very heightened senses. It's going to be off. It's going to sound off. The other day, and I'll just wrap it up with this kind of. I keep some speakers outside, and one of the tweeters wasn't working in the left speaker. And I was standing there in the backyard, and I just kind of thought, this is something that doesn't sound the same as it did last time I used these speakers. But I didn't think much of it. I just thought, oh, well, whatever. Maybe there's different humidity in the air. Maybe the direction the wind blows and how the wind blows can affect how things sound. Absolutely. When the wind, for instance, by the way, and it's the end of the story with his speakers, as I got closer and I realized, oh, the tweeter in the left speaker is out. I'll have to rewire it, reconnect it. The way the wind blows has an effect on sound. You may not think of it, but it does. For instance, when I lived in Austin, there was a highway just a little bit north of my apartment complex, directly outside of my window. There was a lot of trees in the way, but I knew there was a street out there. It was Palmer and Mopac is the area that I used to live in, North Austin. But there was a road outside my window, maybe a mile, obscured by trees. On most days, I couldn't hear the road, or it was extremely faint. On other days, you could hear it like it was right outside. And it dawned on me, it 100% depends on which way the wind is blowing. If the wind is blowing towards me and the air mass that the sound waves are traveling through are moving towards me, it's using that momentum to carry those sound waves more strongly towards me. That's why it sounded a lot louder. Versus on a normal day, when the wind was blowing away from the apartment towards the road, I couldn't hear the road because literally the sound waves were pushing up against the air mass from which they travel through towards me. They were, picture standing in the middle of a river, of a stream, and there's current. Now picture you are trying to push your hand through the current. If you're pushing it upstream against the current, you can push your hands, it goes slower through the current. The water's pushing against your hand versus turning around and now push your hand with the current. You might fall over because the current carries your hand. That's the exact same thing that happens with sound waves, or it's very, 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 very similar. So the way the wind blows sounds like a song. It can affect sound. You could go to Red Rocks. I haven't heard of this occurring, and I'll really wrap it up with this. You could go to Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado, and if the wind is blowing in a bad direction, it can sound crappy. It can affect the sound. Versus if the wind is just right, the acoustics are great. But I would imagine that a world-famous venue like Red Rocks has a sound system that can account for the way the wind is blowing. The way the wind blowing affects the high, the treble in this area of the venue. We need to boost the treble in these speakers here to compensate for which way the wind is blowing. It's a science. Like I said, it's a science. And the fact that we are capturing the acoustics of famous places is amazing. And if we aren't ramping it up, we should ramp it up. Very cool concept. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked the podcast, if you like Geek Therapy Radio in general, share it with your friends. I'd love if you would share it with your friends. Too often we hear people say, our friends say, man, I'm getting bored of the podcast. You got any new podcasts you can recommend? Geek Therapy Radio. I would love to be the podcast that they eventually get bored of and move on to something else and then come back to. If they listen to me so much that they tend to get bored, say, you know what? That's all right with me, as long as they're listening. So if you have friends and family that you think would enjoy it, I would love if you would tell them about Geek Therapy Radio Podcast. Just tell them to look for, if you don't send them the link, tell them to look for the red, white, and black color scheme when they search for it in their favorite podcast player. But most of all, remind them, even if they never hear this podcast, just what I remind you every podcast. You are worthy of love. We're all worthy of a slap in the face once in a while. But overall, we are worthy of love. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love. I love you. And you are worthy of receiving love when someone says they love you. You can believe it because you are worthy of it. You are also worthy of your own self-respect. So embrace your inner geek. Rekindle an old hobby. Find a new hobby. Share your geek thing with others. Please take care and be safe. And I can't wait to talk to you next time.